So today we're going to do something a little different and showcase the power of Bladesong. I've done a couple videos on Bladesong before. This time we're going to be using it to recreate a design that a buddy of mine is having made for an actual real-life blade being sent to a smith. So this is a video done with the assistance of my buddy Beardo. Shout out to Mr. Beardo. He is making a blade that I haven't talked about on the channel too much. That is a type of broadsword, specifically a basket-hilted broadsword. So these are most famous, perhaps coming from Scotland. They're sometimes called claymore. We're not going to get into the discussion about what type of sword is or isn't a claymore. It's a very long, complicated discussion. But we'll go into some of the history of it as we're going through how this sword is made. So here we'll bring up the specs, which is kind of interesting because this is a sword that has very complicated cross sections. So it starts off with a very thick ricasso. It has multiple fullers at the base, after which it has just a single fuller that continues after the initial thick fort section. Then it transitions into a lenticular section that continues all the way to the end where it has a nice kind of gradual rounded tip, which is both effective for thrusting and has a lot of presence in the end to allow it to have a lot of cutting potential even past the center of percussion. So right now I am trying to put profile taper in the blade to make sure that it has the appropriate width both at the original base of the blade and at the narrowest part right before we have to transition to the tip. Now I'm adding the point on the blade. So the way that Bladesong works, you build the blade using different components. So you can first flatten it and then narrow it, extend the blade out, draw it out. This isn't the actual process that a blacksmith would use, but it's the way that the game interprets your different commands in order to be able to manipulate the billet that you have on the anvil. In this case, I'm going to be experimenting with a couple different ways to add the correct amount of distal taper to make the blade appropriately thin all the way at the different points that are measured per the original blueprints. So these Scottish swords are pretty interesting. They start off in the 16th century. The 16th century is when basket hilts really seem to take off all across Europe. We can find them in German, Italian, Dutch areas, and certainly in Britain as well. So English and Scottish swords both kind of develop in parallel with these cool basket-hilted designs, and you can find different types of blades on them. So although this one is going to be a broadsword, meaning that it has two edges, you can also find back swords, so it would look almost exactly the same but just have a single edge and then have a flat spine on the reverse. There's a wonderful article by Jeffrey Ross that I would recommend you check out if you want to see the development of how these swords came about. I'll put up an image that shows the development from that article that shows the progression of Scottish hilts, and you can see exactly how distinct that they developed even over a 100-year period if we start in the middle of the 15th century and go into the 17th century. Initially, there was very little distinction between Scottish baskets and English baskets. As we go 100 years into the development of basket hilts, they distinguish themselves quite a bit. These designs continued so that even by the end of the 19th century, when swords are on their way out, you can usually tell the difference between a Scottish basket hilt and an English basket hilt. So at this point, I'm adding different types of cross section, and Bladesong again allows you to not only put different cross sections on different sections of the blade, but even layer multiple cross sections on the same section of blade you're working on. I am by far not the most skilled artist. There are people who can do truly amazing things in Bladesong and make all sorts of unorthodox shapes, or just make incredibly fantastic swords if that's what you're interested in. This is going to be a reasonably short kind of Spartan video because this type of sword is something that I figured I could produce in a reasonably short period of time, just as an exercise and a way to show everyone what can be done. So I'm adjusting both the width and depth that the central fuller is going to be. I'm bringing the edges in so that there's no shoulder on the fuller, rotating it around, and then I'm going to be adding on the secondary fullers, which because I have bilateral symmetry on, they will have two central fullers. If I wanted just a single one, I could do that. I could cycle it to just be working on one side of the blade at a time instead of both sides of the blade at the same time. So in this case, the designs call for just these two little fullers in the ricasso area, which you do see on many designs. It's not to say that it was always the case. There are examples of asymmetrical designs and asymmetrical fullers. I'd say that's more common on backswords because again, backswords are single-edged swords, and they're more likely to see asymmetry in single-edged designs than you are in broadswords that are double-edged. Make sure that there are appropriate depth, and again, a convenient point is that wherever your cursor is, you're able to see what the cross-section of the blade is in at that very moment. Make sure that it's the appropriate width, appropriate depth, thickness. And now adjusting the terminus of the fuller so that it matches up with the specs that we're given. The principle behind how this game is going to be done is that you will be a smith at in a kingdom, and presumably something equivalent to a fantasy medieval period, and you will be tasked with completing swords that are being ordered to some type of specifications. So they've said, the designers, who are really cool guys, have said that even though you can make amazing swords here, the goal of the game is not an art game. This isn't an art program or a rendering program like Blender, so you're never going to have the ability to put a background picture that you can then trace or mimic, since that's not the goal of Bladesong. There's going to be some sort of a gameplay mechanic that they'll implement that they've only given us little hints about, little teasers about. So at this point, the blade is really taking shape, and we have, again, a lens cross-section in the latter parts of it. The tip has the appropriate shape. I'll add a little bit of polish to the blade now so that it's a little bit easier to see what the geometry is. And this, again, would have been consistent with swords back in the day. A lot of reproductions nowadays seem to prefer to have more of a satin polish than a high mirror polish. I'm not sure exactly why that's the case. It might be because many low-end swords actually use very high degrees of polish, and so unfortunately high-end makers, perhaps in order to distinguish their wares, choose a different type of either matte or satin polish in order to show that they're of a different quality than these kind of swords that you can find at mall kiosks. But once upon a time, having a mirror polish on a blade would have shown that you were a very high status person and could afford to have folks polish your steel till you could see yourself reflected in it. So I think that more makers probably need to have it have their swords polished to a slightly higher degree. So you can see that, keeping with the some of those earlier period basket hilt designs, I opted to go with a ball pommel. I don't have a flattened style squashed pommel like modern Scottish basket hilted swords would have. Now, in order to turn this into something like a complex guard, I'm going to have to cheat a little bit. I have a disc guard, but since this is mostly designed for medieval swords, I'm going to have to make my own complex guard. So in this case, I can use a curved quillon and just stack it, and that will allow me to make a rudimentary knuckle bow. And it won't be a full basket hilt, but at least this way it looks something like you'd find perhaps on an officer's sword or some of the more lightly defended swords going into the 18th century. So this is the world's heaviest spadroon, perhaps. A broadsword mounted on a very light hilt, but it just gives an impression of what it might look like, and hopefully my friend gets a kick out of what his sword would look like if it came to light. So that gives you an idea. Once you become dexterous at it, if you're trying to create blades and you have a source material that you're working from, it can go pretty fast. This is the materials page where you can doll everything up to make it look very pretty. And on the whole, Bladesong continues to be a very resourceful tool if you want to very quickly hammer out a design that you have in your head and want to bring it to life and see what it looks like in 3D. And you don't know Blender, or if you don't know one of the other Maya or what have you, one of the other 3D modeling softwares. In addition to being a lot of fun, this one is a great one for designing swords. So once again, I heartily endorse it. Check out the guys as they're developing it, and we'll see everyone next time.